Joining me live on the broadcast from Xiamen at the moment is my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran. Ramesh, you know, I keep trying to bring up everything that's happening around Xiamen, but I can't help but ask you questions about that bilateral which is about to take place between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. There's so many issues on hand, even though the Doklam issue might have been resolved for now. Take us through what you think is going to be some of the impactful points of discussion that are going to take place today.
Right. So, Aisha, we are counting down to the much anticipated meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India and President Xi Jinping of China. It'll take place about less than 20 minutes from now at about 12:30 p.m. Xiamen time or about 10 a.m. India time. And just to give you a flavor of their past discussions, Aisha, this would be their third meeting this year alone. Remember, they met in the month of June at Astana in Kazakhstan when the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, took place there. The second meeting was an informal one, a much talked about handshake between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi on the margins of the Hamburg summit in Germany. That's the G20 summit, and this, as I said, would be their third meeting this year. And this meeting would take place barely more than 1 week after the resolution of the Doklam standoff on the 28th of August. And before that, it was not sure whether Prime Minister Modi would indeed be traveling to Xiamen for the 9th BRICS summit here. But that resolution on the 28th signaled the positive trend, as it were, and the official confirmation of India's participation was made only after the issue was resolved. And that, to my mind, is an important, significant milestone in India-China relationship, bedeviled as it is by decades of tension, an element of a mix of cooperation and competition at the same time. But it is customary for BRICS leaders to meet bilaterally on the margins of every BRICS summit, Aisha.
Right.
And it is no surprise that President Xi will be meeting on a bilateral level basis with Prime Minister Modi. And when two principals meet, Aisha, they can be expected to discuss bilateral, regional and global issues. And Indian diplomats are telling us they don't want to second guess what Prime Minister Modi will indeed share with President Xi. But one can expect him to forcefully present India's side of the argument, as it were, and devise a way forward in resolving issues such as Doklam. If they do indeed happen in the future, India should have a mechanism in place so that such issues can be tackled without peacefully and without snowballing into a crisis,
right,
like we saw happen at Doklam.
All right, Ramesh Ramachandran, thanks very much for joining us with that update. We'll get back to you once that all-important meeting is over. But in the studio with me now is former Ambassador of India to the United States, Arun Kumar Singh, one appointment among others in your very long and distinguished career. Good morning, Ambassador. Thanks very much for joining us here. I already took that question to Ramesh, but I'd love to hear your perspective as well, because this is an expected meeting. But do you think with Doklam and then yesterday, terrorism making such an impactful way into that declaration at Xiamen, that this meeting takes on even more important tones?
I agree with you entirely. This meeting is taking place at a very interesting point. The issues between India and China at Doklam have been resolved diplomatically, so that was significant. And the BRICS summit has progressed so far very successfully. And from India's point of view, aside from the important references to global issues, financial issues, trade-related issues, there are very significant references related to terrorism, to Pakistan-based terror groups. Although many have argued that similar references were there at the Heart of Asia conference, which was there in December last year, the fact remains that this has now happened in the framework of the BRICS, and at a summit taking place in China. So that is certainly significant. The third reason this meeting is interesting is because at this precise moment, the regional and global situation is a bit of a challenge for China.
Right.
North Korea has just exploded a powerful nuclear explosive device. As a result, there is heightened regional tension, there is heightened global tension. There are bound to be some repercussions. There is a move for more sanctions against North Korea.
Yes.
There is a possibility of US sanctioning specific Chinese entities. The manner in which South Korea and Japan react and assess China's reactions to what's happening in North Korea is going to impact on China and the region and beyond. And the fact remains that two of China's closest partners, Pakistan and North Korea are seen as not very responsible members in the international community.
Right.
One related to terrorism, the other related to nuclear and missiles. And Pakistan and North Korea have proliferated nuclear and missile technology to each other.
Right.
So at this moment, when China is under watch and some pressure, both in the regional and international context, how does it address its issues related to India? So I think keeping that in mind, the meeting that is going to take place will certainly be very, very significant.
What do you make of suggestions that there might have been some sort of a trade-off between India and China? That why would China suddenly, after Doklam, after for years not agreeing to proscribe Masood Azhar, for instance, even mentioning Pakistan as a haven of terror, suddenly agreeing in many ways? I won't take away from the fact that this is a multilateral forum, but for many people, it's all about India and China, especially us sitting here in New Delhi. What do you think of those suggestions that there might have been a trade-off?
So, in any negotiation, especially when you're negotiating a document and a multilateral document, there are always trade-offs. That you agree to something, but you expect to get satisfaction somewhere else. So, trade-offs cannot be ruled out. But at the same time, the fact that similar reference was there at the Heart of Asia conference in December last year, where China was present, where Russia was present, where even Pakistan was present, would have strengthened the hands of negotiators to argue that there's no reason to stop a reference like that coming into the BRICS document. And so certainly that argument would also have been there.
All right. Also, I was reading just this morning that even the World Health Organization today has, in very glowing terms, talked about BRICS as a forum, saying that it's a fantastic place for development to take place, for talk to happen. Do you think that this declaration yesterday's and the way it has tackled terror, there are 32 mentions in a 43-page document of the word terror itself. Do you think that it's also set the tone for global conversations in many ways about how to tackle terror, not just as an amorphous identity, but the fact that terror is receiving support, succor, and is proliferating through social media, for instance?
So I think it would certainly add to the global conversation. I don't believe it will decisively change the global conversation.
Sure.
Because there is already a significant amount of global conversation taking place on terrorism, what should be done. For example, if you look at the August 21 statement that the US President Donald Trump made, it was very hard on terrorism and Pakistan-based support to terrorist groups. So what has emerged from BRICS will certainly add to that. But I think what is emerging from BRICS would add significantly also to the global conversations on trade and economic issues.
Sure.
Because as you know, there is a certain message coming out from US, from Europe, West in general, which is veering towards going back on the kind of trade expansion, globalization that was happening, supporting protectionist measures. And I think the message coming out from the BRICS summit is that trade expansion, trade engagement is an important dimension for economic development. So, and that on global financial issues, in terms of global international financial architecture,
right.
The non-Western countries should also have a significant say in the norms, the regulations that are brought out. And these are also very, very important messages.
Absolutely. In terms of this meeting that we're building up to at 10 a.m. between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, what do you think are going to be, we spoke about broad contours, but in terms of the specifics, what do you think is going to come up for conversation pretty much early on in that interaction?
So, well, as you know, very often whenever these meetings take place, a lot of preparation is done, briefs are prepared, briefing meetings are held, but eventually the leaders decide what they're going to bring up. That having been said, one can expect that there would be perhaps satisfaction expressed at the manner in which Doklam was resolved diplomatically, perhaps an expression of hope that going forward such situations can be avoided, and that the mechanisms that are there for resolving the difference between the two countries will be used productively to address other challenges. And I think guidance to people on both sides to look at expanding the trade and economic relationship, having more intensified dialogue on regional and global political issues, and also see how the mechanisms for managing border differences or mechanisms for resolving the border issue can be taken forward.
Fair enough. What about the hot topics that come up every time there's a meeting between India and China, such as NSG membership, such as Masood Azhar? Do you think those are too specific in nature for them to come up between conversation of two principles of two states?
Well, one can always expect that perhaps those issues could be flagged, but unless there has been a lot of discussion and preparation beforehand, one shouldn't expect that they'll be resolved. But it would not be surprised if they are flagged as issues of concern to India. And then the two sides can work on how to take forward that conversation.
All right. In fact, just allow me, Ambassador, to just remind our viewers that these are live visuals coming in from Xiamen. Just to remind all of you, there will be a bilateral between the man there on your screen, President Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi shortly. We are building up to that meeting. Lots of subtext to the conversation that's going to take place later. Trying to make sense of what might come up for conversation. And in the studio with us, of course, is Ambassador Arun Singh to help us make sense of what might just happen at 10 o'clock. There's so many mights and ifs and buts, Ambassador. But if I could also ask you, we've talked about the brass tacks maybe, but also in terms of larger policy conversations between the two countries. Do you think after Doklam, India and China have sort of had a watershed moment in their history, and that is going to determine in many ways the way the two countries negotiate with one another going forward?
So I think one should not overinterpret what has happened as a resolution of the Doklam issue. It has certainly been significant. It has been significant because India was able to express its concerns. India was able to get a resolution that was satisfactory from its point of view. But that doesn't mean that similar issues may not happen in the future, or that such issues have not happened in the past. But I think the important thing is for both sides to take lessons from this and to work better the mechanisms that are there already for discussions related to the border issue. And the fact is that China's economic and military strength has grown over the years. And once a country's economic and other strengths grow, their presence in the region surrounding them expands. And as India has grown its presence in South Asia, in Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, in the Gulf and West Asia has grown. And one can expect the Chinese presence will grow. And some of that will cause concern to us in terms of what China may be doing in Sri Lanka, what it may be doing in Maldives, in Nepal and other places. So we have to work in a longer term framework to protect our national interest and also to work with China through dialogue to address areas where we may have concern.
All right, we'll ask you to hold that thought for a second. Premier Xi Jinping is speaking at Xiamen right now. Let's listen in to what he's saying.
A lot of attention from the international community. Having stood the test of major challenges, including the global financial crisis, BRICS countries have embarked on a new path of promoting solidarity and win-win cooperation among emerging market and developing countries. Leaders are determined to take the Xiamen Summit as a new starting point, renew the commitment, and work even harder for a closer, broader, and more comprehensive strategic partnership, and for another golden decade of BRICS cooperation. We BRICS leaders believe that the world today is undergoing profound and complex changes. While the world economic outlook is improving, all sorts of global challenges continue to emerge. As nations with major influence, BRICS countries must step up communication and coordination on important issues and work for a more just and equitable international order. We must play a constructive role and uphold the basic norms governing international relations and international fairness and justice. We must work together to address global challenges, promote open, inclusive, and balanced economic globalization that is beneficial to all, speed up global economic governance reform, increase the representation and voice of emerging market and developing countries, and create an enabling external environment for the development of all countries. We BRICS leaders believe that practical cooperation is the root of BRICS cooperation. A tree will only flourish when its root goes deep. We will, in line with the principle of mutual benefit, step up macro policy coordination, synergize development strategies, and deepen all-round cooperation in areas such as economy, trade, finance, industry, and sustainable development so as to bring about interconnected development. This year, BRICS practical cooperation has made new headway and gained even greater importance. We have developed cooperation roadmaps in areas such as trade facilitation, trading services, currency swaps, local currency settlement, and public and private partnership. We have set up the African Regional Center of the New Development Bank and put together the BRICS Innovation Cooperation Action Plan. Thanks to our efforts over the past year, we have made new strides towards greater connectivity in trade, in investment, in currency and finance, and in infrastructure. We all stress the need to place more emphasis on innovation, seize the historic opportunities offered by the new round of industrial revolution, and improve economic structure at a faster pace so as to secure more resilient, sustainable, and quality growth for all. We BRICS leaders believe that it is in our common interests to deepen political and security cooperation and enhance mutual strategic trust. This is also what the international community expects us to do. Since the start of this year, we have had in-depth exchanges of views and reached important consensus on such issues as the international situation, global governance, international and regional hotspots, and national security and development. The meeting of high representatives for security issues and the first foreign ministers meeting we held this year have injected fresh impetus to closer political and security cooperation. We have instituted regular consultations among our permanent representatives in New York, Geneva, and Vienna to coordinate positions on major issues of common interest. We are making steady progress in our cooperation on counterterrorism, cybersecurity, peacekeeping, and the Middle East. All these efforts have raised the profile of BRICS. We support efforts to continue the good momentum of political and security cooperation, and we will play our part and contribute more to world peace and stability. We BRICS leaders believe that the long history and splendid culture of our respective countries are our valued assets and must be cherished. This year has seen flourishing people-to-people exchanges and cooperation among our 5 countries. Colorful events like the BRICS Games, Film Festival, Cultural Festival, high-level meeting on traditional medicine have proved popular with our people. We are also advancing cooperation between our legislatures, political parties, think tanks, young people, and local authorities to create platforms for people with different backgrounds to participate in BRICS cooperation. We support efforts to institutionalize people-to-people exchanges, as they will contribute to greater mutual understanding and friendship and base the idea of partnership on more solid public support. At the summit, we BRICS leaders share the view that as BRICS cooperation enters its second decade, institution building has to move forward in keeping with the changing times if we are to secure strong support for deeper and more substantive cooperation across the board. We support a stronger mandate for our Sherpas and expect them to take stock of the follow-ups to every summit at regular intervals and explore new ways and paths of BRICS cooperation in order to bring our 5 countries closer together. As a matter of fact, this year we have already made new progress in BRICS institution building. I have mentioned the first formal foreign ministers meeting and the regular consultations among our UN permanent representatives. In addition to these 2 examples, we have also set up cooperation platforms such as a model e-port network, a working group on e-commerce, and alliances of museums, art museums, and national galleries, and libraries. These new mechanisms will lend strong support to our efforts to deepen political, economic, and cultural cooperation. Next year, South Africa will assume the BRICS chairmanship and will host the 10th BRICS summit in Johannesburg. We trust that next year's summit will yield fruitful outcomes. China is ready to work with others to give full support to South Africa in hosting the summit and work together to move forward BRICS cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a fine tradition for BRICS to conduct dialogue and cooperation with other emerging market and developing countries. Under the current circumstances, such dialogue and cooperation have become all the more important. The dialogue of emerging market and developing countries hosted by China has sent a strong message for closer South-South cooperation and global development cooperation. Leaders attending the dialogue agree that emerging markets and developing countries who enjoy good growth momentum are well placed to play a bigger role when it comes to implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and improving global economic governance. We need to deepen South-South cooperation, create a BRICS Plus cooperation approach, reach out extensively to other countries, and establish an open and diverse network of development partners. Together, we can blaze a sustainable path featuring innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development, and inject more positive energy to global growth and shared prosperity. To conclude, let me take this opportunity to thank other BRICS leaders and friends from the business, think tank, cultural, and sports communities for your strong support for China's BRICS chairmanship. My thanks also go to the friends from the media who have been working really hard. I know that
all right, President Xi Jinping there speaking at the Xiamen Summit, talking about the next decade coming up for the BRICS countries. Former Ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, with us in the studio to talk more about that. So what do you see as the profile of BRICS in this new decade? 10 years are up, another 10 years are coming up. Critics have said that it's sort of, it's a toothless tiger in many ways. What do you see as its role in the new decade?
So as you mentioned, BRICS have in a sense completed 1 decade since the process was started, although they've had only 9 summits.
Right.
And people have asked the question whether they remain relevant today, where many of the countries who are part of BRICS are not growing as fast as they grew earlier. But at the same time, they account for more than 40% of the world population, more than 20% of the global GDP. And they bring a non-Western perspective on major international issues and bring them out for global discussion. From that point of view, it is significant. as part of their work, they have achieved certain amount. The new development bank has been set up.
Right.
It is giving loans. The contingency reserve arrangement has been operationalized for tapping currency requirements at a moment of crisis. But most important, it has also strengthened institutional links between the different BRICS countries. So at one level, India's links with China, India's links with Russia, trade, economic, other links are strong. But when you start looking at the links with countries in Africa, in Latin America, they're not as strong as one would like them. So they have worked to develop institutional links. President Xi, in his own comments, referred to different levels at which dialogue is taking place, institutional links are being strengthened. So I think going forward, what would be important is that the current global challenges that we are faced with, where growth rates have slowed down, there's a tendency and pressure in US and Europe to move towards putting up more trade barriers, towards more protectionism.
Right.
Then how do we protect the interests of the developing and emerging market countries? So the voice coming out on that would be important. Then there are many regional political issues, for example, let's say Syria or Afghanistan, where very often the Western perspective would look at it only from the point of view of the United States or Europe.
Right.
And it is important that other perspectives are also brought into the discussion. Again, a grouping like BRICS, with the kind of countries that come together, brings an element of multipolarity in the international system. And from India's point of view, where we want to have strategic autonomy in our decision making, it is very important that there be a multipolar world rather than the world dominated just by one country or one group of countries, so that we can maximize the space and autonomy for pursuing our national interests. So I think keeping all this in mind in the decade to come, in the areas that have been identified, be it in terms of green economy, be it in terms of digital, be it in terms of cyber, be it in terms of trade and economic issues, people-to-people interaction, the BRICS countries would certainly enhance their levels of engagement, interaction, and that will have a positive impact on the global situation.
What about environment and climate change issues? Considering, of course, the tectonic shift that's taking place with President Trump taking power in the United States and his whole approach to climate change, the Paris Accord, for instance, does this also create a huge opportunity for countries like India and China to lead the way when it comes to battling climate change?
Certainly. So I think at the moment, both India and China are working on maintaining what was agreed to in Paris and taking it forward. And at the same time, while there is a convergence between the Indian and Chinese position, there are also differences. Because in India, for example, we are suffering from the consequences of global warming, but we have not contributed to global warming because the level of emissions in India are far below what's happening from China. But in China, with the growth in manufacturing, with industrialization that has taken place, China has emerged as perhaps the leading, if not the second, emitter in terms of greenhouse gases. So China's position there is somewhat different. But I think within the framework of BRICS, also with Brazil, South Africa and others taking a certain position related to climate change issues, one can expect that the thrust would be that the global norms that are developed, the global energy that has developed to support renewable energy, non-conventional energy sources, and to maintain the consensus to address climate change, that should be maintained and taken forward, because it would be in our interest, because we are suffering from the consequences.
In fact, the Prime Minister did make mention of solar energy, renewable energy in his comments at the plenary yesterday. I know that we've spoken about what's happened today, but I'm going to come back to India and China. That meeting is apparently going to get underway very shortly now. Earlier, you mentioned Pakistan and the fact that, China has always been considered an all-weather ally of Pakistan. Islamabad has found itself sort of isolated, especially after President Trump's comments on his new Afghan policy. How do you see the Shaman Declaration and its mention of terror impacting the relationship between China and Pakistan, if at all?
So at one level, with Pakistan coming under increasing international pressure, including from the US, their dependence on China will increase because they don't have too many backers. China finds Pakistan useful in pursuing its foreign policies in South Asia, in the broader Asian region. And Pakistan enables China to have enhanced leverage. So I don't anticipate China sort of turning away from Pakistan or taking a very hard line against Pakistan. At the same time, China would be concerned at stability in Pakistan. It would be concerned at stability in Afghanistan. And there are terrorist groups who are operating from Pakistan and Afghanistan who are also directing China. Because if you see in the list of groups, groups have been mentioned that are directed against China.
Yes.
I think what happens is that Pakistan to some extent buys peace with China on this by taking action against groups that are attacking China in cooperation with the Chinese. So there is this complex effort going on. Many countries in the West, for example, in the past were not so critical of Pakistan because on the groups that were attacking them, Pakistan was providing cooperation. But while encouraging other groups who were attacking Afghanistan or attacking India. So I would say that perhaps China would want stability in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Perhaps China would want Pakistan in a medium, longer term framework to move away from its support to terrorism, that kind of policy, or support to terrorist groups. But I don't think they were to turn away from them.
All right, but speaking of Islamabad, after President Trump's statement on August 21st, there was a lot of public outcry. You know, they did condemn his comments. He said Pakistan has been working towards fighting terror. Do you think that the Shaman declaration is also possibly going to generate some sort of commentary in Pakistan? Because it would come as an affront to Pakistan, the fact that Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed are mentioned in the declaration.
You're right. I think the fact that Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar are mentioned in a declaration at a summit happening in China, I think so that would be certainly something noted in Pakistan. But I think those who take the decisions in Pakistan, and as you know, Pakistan is largely controlled by the army and the ISI, and of course the civilian government is seen as not being very strong vis-a-vis them. So from their perspective, they have been so heavily involved in using terrorism and terrorist groups that what they will probably try and do in response to the current situation is give some measure of satisfaction to those who are criticizing them. So they may take a little action, they may hand over some people and try and show to President Trump that here you've got some success following what you've said, and then they will buy for time. But so what one would expect that if the international community sustains the pressure on Pakistan, then perhaps over time we may begin to see a shift, but not in the immediate framework.
So what do you make of Prime Minister Modi's decision to not mention Pakistan in his comments yesterday? And I ask you this because last year he was very specific about speaking about Pakistan. I'm talking about the BRICS summit in Goa. He called Pakistan the mothership of terror. He literally said that terror is being spawned within the boundaries of Pakistan. But this year there's been a complete change in stance. He's not made mention of Pakistan at all. Why do you think that happened?
So again, these things are decided based on the context of that moment, what is happening and what is likely to get you maximum advantage. And I would say that since issues of concern to us are well reflected in the summit outcome and the summit document, our concerns are addressed.
Okay. We spoke of confidence-building measures that might come up for conversation between Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi. What exactly are achievable confidence-building measures between the two countries, given their history and given what's happened in Doklam recently?
So as you know, in 1993, India and China had signed an agreement on peace and tranquility on the border. And then 3 years later, there was an agreement on confidence-building measures on the border. So there are well-established in literature measures that can be taken along a border that is not an agreed border in terms of enhancing confidence as the militaries of the two sides operate there. To sort of maintain their positions, to assert how they see as their point of view in that region. But it is important that while all that happens, the tension between the two sides size doesn't escalate beyond a point. So all that requires certain norms to be followed in terms of how patrolling is done, how information is shared, and in case of difference, how that is to be addressed. So these are the kind of things that would be very important.
All right, but all right, I'm being told that my colleague, WION senior editor Surya Gangadharan is also joining us on the conversation. He's at the WION International Desk. Good morning, Surya. We're still talking about India and China, just as we were yesterday. But today, I guess we've got more specifics to talk about, given what happened at the declaration yesterday and that specific mention of Pakistan-based terror groups. I already asked the ambassador this, but I would like your perspective as well. When it comes to the relationship between Pakistan and China, the fact that Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed were mentioned in that declaration, do you see that that having some sort of impact on the relationship between Pakistan and China, or is that too forged in steel for any sort of dent to take place?
Well, as the Pakistanis and the Chinese describe their relationship, they are iron brothers. So I don't think these declarations are really going to affect the flow of the relationship. In any case, many of these references made in the declaration yesterday were there in earlier declarations also, including the Heart of Asia, as Ambassador Singh and I were discussing a little earlier. These points were made, and in that sense, it's nothing new. And to expect this to affect the broader China-Pakistan strategic ties would be, I think, inaccurate. Their ties are, close, they are strong, they have a certain direction. They are not going to be affected by these declarations made at BRICS.
All right, fair enough. We were also speaking of confidence-building measures between India and China that will possibly come up, Surya, for conversation at that meeting that's going to take place between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. If I can ask you, though, when it comes to China, it does pose a unique challenge for India in the sense that with, actual borders not being demarcated, China keeps mentioning historic boundaries and the like. And this is a very long border between the two countries, and it's dotted in parts by these tri-junctions, as we saw with Doklam, as we're seeing also with Myanmar in some ways. Do you think that poses a different sort of challenge for India when negotiating with a neighbor such as China?
I think the border issues apart, there is also the fact that there is an asymmetry in the between India and China, in the fact that that's a bigger country, far greater resources, they have a huge economy, very strong economy, a growing military. The infrastructure on the border along with India again is very well developed. So in that sense, it adds to the insecurities in India. And the fact that the Chinese have been doing a lot of muscle flexing in the South China Sea, disregarding the views and the sentiments of littoral states, adds to the feeling that China is not a very benign power. And in that sense, India has to be up there, it has to be strong, it has to stare the Chinese down in a sense. We did that in Doklam. There is no guarantee that these things will not recur in other parts of the frontier. And as you mentioned, it's a fairly long frontier. So these are dangers that are there. Hopefully they will be sorted out in some measure when the two leaders meet. But given how the Chinese have behaved with respect to the border dispute in all these years, I don't think we can expect miracles.
All right. Stay with me, Ambassador Singh and Surya. I'm also joined on the broadcast by Ramesh Ramachandran, our colleague who is in Xiamen. Ramesh, good morning once again. I was just wondering if, yesterday's press briefing by the Ministry of External Affairs did face a number of questions about the whole conversation on terror within the Xiamen Declaration. There was also a briefing that was done by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Were they probed further on the mention of Lashkar, on the mention of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and how forthcoming were they on answering those questions?
Not really. There was no specific mention of the counter-terrorism, the paragraphs maintained in the Xiamen Declaration. But on balance, what China is indicating to my mind is that it is more amenable than before to considering India's request for a UN ban, a UN proscription on Masood Azhar. Remember, that issue has been hanging fire for a long time now, and it will come up for review in a few weeks' time. And the expectation, at least in the Indian, the official contingent here in Shaman, is that the Shaman declaration might be the signaling of China's intent to begin considering India's request more seriously than before. And the indication is that this might be the first tentative steps towards an eventual concession to India on the issue of a UN ban on Masood Azhar. But that said, there are other issues that are bedeviling the India-China relationship, including but not limited to the nuclear suppliers group issue. India has been wanting to become a member of the NSG for a long time now, and China is the one holdout country which is standing in the way of India becoming a full member of that nuclear cartel, as it were. The other issue is more important from India's security perspective, and that is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is an offshoot of the One Belt, One Road initiative, or the Belt and Road Initiative, first conceptualized by President Xi in 2013. And that has ramifications beyond the immediate, in the sense that it directly questions or challenges India's sovereignty and territorial integrity at the same time, all at once. And when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi meet, one can expect them to discuss and raise bilateral, regional and global issues of mutual concern. And President Xi has just left the venue of his press conference here at the media center.
Right.
And the meeting, the bilateral, would have begun by now, I'm told. And one will have to wait and watch for the outcome of those bilateral talks.
Absolutely. Ambassador Singh, sovereignty and territorial integrity, those keep coming up from the Chinese side when, questions are being raised about the South China Sea, etc. So an interesting fact that India will bring up sovereignty and territorial integrity when it comes to CPEC, but I don't think it's going to hold much water with China.
So I think taking off from what Ramesh just said, on both the issues he mentioned, be it CPEC or NSG, unless China changes its approach to India and Pakistan in a major way, we cannot expect any real forward movement at this stage.
Sure.
Because China's whole effort on the NSG is to try and bring about some equation between India and Pakistan, which is not acceptable to India and to large sections of the international community. Similarly, it sees what it is trying to do through CPEC as part of its strategic thrust through Pakistan into Asia, into the Indian Ocean, which again is not acceptable from our point of view. But you would note that in the summit outcome document, there is no specific endorsement of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
And so that is because the concern that India has related to the sovereignty, territorial integrity issues, and what CPEC therefore means for India. So I would suspect that based on all this, our concerns on all these issues would certainly be flagged. Including the lessons that we take away from Doklam, how we work forward. But there was bound to be some discussion on North Korea and what it means, and because that's something that concerns India, concerns China, also Afghanistan. That following from the recent US decision, what can we do to promote stability? So some of these regional issues are bound to come up for discussion as a way of generating enhanced conversation between these two countries, because we have to build elements of dialogue and cooperation even as we have differences. And that's very critical for the diplomatic process.
In fact, even President Xi's comments this morning, the word cooperation did come up repeatedly. And Surya, if I can come to you next, speaking of North Korea, for instance, India, in a departure of sorts, was very forthcoming in its indictment of what happened on Sunday. And perhaps that also indicates how India sees itself beyond just a major power within the South Asia region, but having comments and a statement and a viewpoint on what's happening in the larger Asia region as well.
Well, do recall, Aisha, that North Korea has a hoary history of taking part in the black marketing of nuclear weapons and components, including missile parts.
Right.
And if you go back to the days of A.Q. Khan, and there was North Korea, there was Pakistan, there was China, that were involved in this black market. A whole lot of other countries were receiving and selling materials. So in that sense, our perception of North Korea is grounded in those kind of activities. So when we take a strong stand on North Korea and go along with the issue of sanctions on North Korea, it reflects the broader view that this country has been a destabilizing, has a destabilizing impact on international security, and doesn't play by the rules in that sense. So when we take a strong stand in North Korea, it reflects all those perceptions. North Korea's role, the fact that it's a constant saber rattling doesn't help resolve issues in the Korean Peninsula either.
Absolutely, and I suppose the saber rattling only instigates President Trump a little bit more. But stay with me, gentlemen. We've also just gotten a little bit of a soundbite from somebody who did come up for conversation, at least in Indian newsrooms yesterday, especially at a time when BRICS nations were jointly condemning terror. The Jamaat-ud-Dawa deputy chief, Abdul Rahman Makki, has openly threatened to intensify jihad against India in Jammu and Kashmir. He made these remarks against India during a conference at Al-Dawa Model School in Lahore, Pakistan. Listen in to what Makki had to say. All right, so Makki once again talking of jihad against India and Jammu and Kashmir, and I suppose, Ambassador, that brings us back to the ground reality that at meetings like BRICS, there can be a global condemnation of terror, there can be an indictment of terror outfits, but till the time on the ground action isn't taken against people such as Makki and others, things aren't really going to change very dramatically.
No, that's absolutely right. And the fact is that international community over time has been making strong statements, attempting to generate pressure on Pakistan. You recall that Hafiz Saeed himself was sanctioned, and there was an award that the US had announced. And Masood Azhar has also been sanctioned by the US and others. But Pakistan is able to exploit the fact that it has some support from China, and it remains useful to the US and others in the context of Afghanistan.
It does.
Because all the supplies into Afghanistan for US troops have to go through Pakistan, because alternative routes are not there. So it is able to leverage its utility in that framework to escape harsher measures and continue the negative orientation of its policies. So I think the effort has to continue.
Right.
And the fact remains that with time, more and more, there is a recognition that Pakistan is a problem in the international context, and we have to work with that.